Your tickets are suspicious. I'm getting you off this plane right now.
You little black apes don't belong in first class. A flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin of Delta Airlines Flight 4729 bound for Washington, D.C. like a verbal assault designed to wound as deeply as possible. His face twisted with disgust as he stood over two young black boys sitting quietly with their textbooks open studying debate notes. These seats are for real passengers who actually earned their place here, not for whatever charity case or mistake put you animals where you clearly don't belong. Now get your things and move to the back before I have security drag you off this plane. The words hit 13-year-old Joshua like physical blows, each syllable of violence that made his hands shake so hard the pages of his debate book trembled visibly, and beside him his 11-year-old brother Elias started crying immediately, tears streaming down his round cheeks as he looked up at this adult authority figure with confusion and terror written across his young face because they'd done nothing wrong. Absolutely nothing except exist in seats their school had carefully selected and paid premium prices for to honor their achievement, to celebrate them reaching the finals of the National Youth Debate Championship that was happening in just 4 hours, the competition they'd worked toward for an entire year and were now at risk of missing because a racist flight attendant had decided their black skin disqualified them from comfort regardless of merit or payment or basic human dignity. This wasn't something from history books, this wasn't a story their grandfather told them about the bad old days of segregation and Jim Crow. This was happening right now in 2025 aboard a modern aircraft with touchscreen entertainment and premium meal service. And if you think racism died somewhere between the Freedom Riders and today, if you believe we've evolved past the days when black children were called animals and ordered to the back, then you need to understand something fundamental. It didn't disappear. It just learned to wear uniforms and name tags while wielding the same dehumanizing language, the same casual cruelty, maybe even worse now because it pretends not to exist while actively destroying young lives with the same efficiency it always has, hiding behind policy and authority while enacting the kind of discrimination that was supposed to be illegal, that was supposed to be unthinkable, that clearly still thrives whenever someone with power decides black excellence is threatening enough to require elimination. Joshua tried to keep his voice steady even though panic was rising in his throat, tried to maintain the composure his debate coach had trained into him through countless practice sessions, and he said as calmly as possible, "Sir, there must be some misunderstanding. We have our boarding passes. Our school purchased these tickets for us. We're traveling to the National Debate Championship finals and we need to be on this flight." He pulled out his phone to show their mobile boarding passes, the screen clearly displaying seats 3A and 3B first class. Their names Joshua Mitchell and Elias Mitchell right there in official Delta Airlines formatting, but the flight attendant whose name tag read Derek Morrison barely glanced at the screen before sneering and saying, "I don't care what your phone shows. Those tickets are fraudulent. No way your kind could afford first class legitimately, and I'm not falling for whatever scam you're trying to pull here." Elias sobbed harder at being called a scammer, at having their accomplishment turned into something criminal, and he whispered to Joshua through his tears, "What did we do wrong? Why is he being so mean to us?" And Joshua had no answer except to wrap his arm around his little brother's shoulders and try to shield him from the hatred radiating from this man who'd appointed himself judge and executioner of their worth based solely on melanin. Other first-class passengers watched the confrontation with varying expressions, some filming on their phones with that detached curiosity that treats other people's trauma as entertainment, some looking uncomfortable but staying silent, a white businessman across the aisle actually nodding along with the flight attendant's assessment as if he agreed these children didn't belong in premium seating, and their collective silence felt like complicity, felt like permission for this abuse to continue unchecked. Joshua looked around desperately for someone to help, for another flight attendant or a pilot or any adult who might intervene, and he made brief eye contact with a black woman several rows back who had tears in her eyes watching this unfold, who looked like she wanted to say something but fear kept her frozen in her seat, and in that moment Joshua understood viscerally what his parents had tried to explain about how racism works, how it isolates its victims while surrounding them with witnesses who choose their own safety over someone else's dignity. "The gate agents confirmed our tickets at check-in," Joshua said with desperation creeping into his voice. "They scanned them and everything. They said we were good to go. Please just check with them." But Derek Morrison waved his hand dismissively like Joshua's words were irrelevant noise not worth considering. The plane's door closed with that heavy thunk that signals departure is imminent. That sound that usually meant adventure beginning but now meant being trapped with their tormentor at 30,000 feet with no escape route and no timeline for rescue. And Derek pulled out what looked like a handheld scanner from his pocket, waving it over Joshua's phone in a gesture that seemed official but was clearly theater, clearly props in a performance designed to justify a decision he'd already made. Before examining any evidence. If you believe children should never be called animals because of their skin color, keep watching, because what happens when these boys' principal finds out will restore your faith that sometimes justice comes for racists who think they're untouchable. And if you've ever stayed silent when you saw discrimination happening right in front of you, drop a comment below about where you're watching from and commit to being different next time, because we're reading every single one and we need you to understand that your silence has consequences. This story doesn't end the way you think. So hit that like button if you stand against racism and subscribe to this channel right now, because what's about to happen to this flight attendant proves that underestimating black excellence comes with a price. These tickets are fake, Derek announced loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear, his voice filled with false authority and real satisfaction. I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy seating in the rear of the aircraft. Consider yourself lucky I'm not having you arrested for fraud. Joshua looked at Elias's devastated face and whispered, "We're going to miss our debate." Joshua whispered, "We're going to miss our debate," through tears that blurred the detailed notes he'd spent months perfecting, the words landing with crushing finality as Derek Morrison stood over them with false authority and real hatred. But to understand how we got here, how two honor students ended up being called animals in first class, we need to go back 9 hours to a middle school in Baltimore where this morning started not with discrimination but with pride and celebration, and a principal who believed in recognizing excellence when he saw it. Joshua Alexander Mitchell, 13 years old, 8th grade captain of the debate team at Frederick Douglass Academy, and his younger brother Elias James Mitchell, 11 years old and 6th grade debate prodigy, had been preparing for the National Youth Debate Championship for an entire academic year, working after school 3 days a week and weekends with their coach Mrs. Henderson, who saw potential in these brothers that went beyond talent into something special, something rare. Joshua was the anchor, the steady logical thinker who could construct arguments like a lawyer building a case brick by methodical brick, while Elias was the emotional orator who could make judges cry with the passion of his delivery, and together they formed a team that had demolished every opponent from regional competitions through state finals to earn their spot at nationals. The first time in their school's 40-year history that a debate team had made it this far. Their school, Frederick Douglass Academy, was a predominantly black public middle school in West Baltimore where most students qualified for free lunch and many came from single-parent households struggling to make ends meet, where academic achievement was celebrated fiercely because education was still seen as the pathway out of generational poverty. And when Joshua and Elias won the state championship back in March, the entire school assembled in the gymnasium to honor them with an assembly that brought teachers to tears and inspired younger students to sign up for debate club in record numbers. Principal Robert Chen, a 52-year-old Chinese-American educator who dedicated his career to uplifting marginalized students, had stood at that assembly and announced that the school would use discretionary funds to purchase first-class tickets for Joshua and Elias to travel to nationals in Washington, D.C., because these boys had earned the right to travel with dignity, to experience what excellence felt like, to understand that their achievement mattered enough to be celebrated with more than just words. Joshua and Elias were being raised by their mother, Angela Mitchell, a nurse at Johns Hopkins Hospital who worked double shifts to keep their small apartment in a safe neighborhood and food on the table, their father having left when Elias was 3 years old to chase opportunities in Atlanta that never materialized into the financial support he'd promised. The boys were each other's best friends and protectors, Joshua teaching Elias how to tie a tie for formal debate events, Elias making Joshua laugh when the pressure of being the older brother and role model got too heavy, and their bond was forged in the particular closeness that comes from being black boys navigating a world that saw them as threats before seeing them as children, that required them to be twice as good to get half as far, that made excellence not just a goal but a survival strategy. That morning they'd woken at 5 a.m., too excited to sleep properly, reviewing their opening statements and rebuttals while their mother made them a breakfast of eggs and toast and repeatedly reminded them to be polite to everyone, to say yes sir and no ma'am, to represent their school and their community with dignity, the same instructions black parents have given their children for generations, knowing that one mistake, one moment of being too loud or too confident, could have consequences their white peers never had to consider. Principal Chen himself had driven them to Baltimore Washington International Airport at 7 a.m., using the hour drive to give them final encouragement and remind them that regardless of how the competition went, they'd already won by getting this far, by showing other students at Douglass Academy what was possible when you worked hard and believed in yourself. Check-in at the Delta counter had been smooth, the agent smiling at them and commenting that they looked very professional in their matching blazers and ties, asking if they were traveling for something special and congratulating them. Security was normal, TSA agents efficient and neutral, waving them through without incident, and they'd waited at gate C-24 for 45 minutes going over their note cards, Joshua testing Elias on rebuttals, both of them feeling that mixture of nervous excitement that comes before important competitions. When boarding was called, they'd walked down the jetway with their small carry-on bags containing their debate materials and one change of clothes, found seats 3A and 3B in the first-class cabin, and settled in with wide eyes, taking in the leather seats and extra legroom and the sense of being valued that came from sitting in a space designed for comfort rather than just function. The plane was a 757, relatively new with clean carpets and working entertainment screens, and other passengers boarding had smiled at them, a kind, elderly white woman pausing to say, "You boys look so handsome in those ties. Where are you headed?" And Joshua had explained about the debate championship and she'd wished them luck with genuine warmth. An Asian American business traveler in the row behind them had leaned forward to ask what their debate topic was, engaging them in a 5-minute conversation about constitutional law that made both boys feel respected and seen, and a young black mother with a baby had caught Joshua's eye and given him a proud nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between black people in predominantly white spaces that says, "I see you, you belong here. Keep going." The initial flight attendants during boarding were lovely, a Latina woman named Rosa who helped them stow their bags and brought them apple juice without being asked, telling them first-class passengers always got beverage service before takeoff and they should enjoy it, they'd earned it, and her warmth had made Elias grin so wide his face hurt, made him feel like maybe the world was kinder than the news and their mother's warnings suggested. Then Derek Morrison appeared, emerging from the forward galley about 10 minutes before scheduled departure, and something about the way his eyes landed on Joshua and Elias made both boys instinctively tense, some survival instinct recognizing danger before their conscious minds could articulate what was wrong, and he approached their row with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and asked in a tone that sounded friendly but felt aggressive, "How are you boys doing today? Mind if I see your boarding passes?" Derek Morrison stood in the aisle at row 3 with a professional smile that somehow managed to feel threatening, his body language radiating the kind of authority that comes from years of wielding power over vulnerable people who can't fight back, and he said in a voice that sounded polite on the surface but carried undertones of suspicion and hostility, "How are you boys doing today? Mind if I see your boarding passes?" The request phrased as optional but delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance that made it clear refusing wasn't actually an option. Joshua pulled out his phone to display their mobile boarding passes, the screen showing clear as day their seat assignments 3A and 3B first class, their names, the Delta Airlines logo official and unquestionable, and he held it up with hands that were steady because he had nothing to hide. Nothing to be nervous about except the instinctive wariness that came from being a black child who'd learned that interactions with authority figures didn't always go well even when you'd done everything. Derek took Joshua's phone without asking permission, his fingers closing around the device in a way that felt like a violation, like he was taking something that didn't belong to him, and he examined the boarding pass with an intensity that suggested he was searching for problems rather than verifying legitimacy. His eyes narrowing as he scrolled and zoomed and tilted the screen as if proper documentation might reveal itself to be fraudulent if viewed from the right angle. "How did you boys afford first-class tickets?" he asked, his tone shifting from polite inquiry to accusatory interrogation. "These seats cost 4 times what economy costs. That's a lot of money for kids your age. Where did you really get these tickets?" The implication hung heavy in the air. The suggestion that black children couldn't possibly have legitimate access to premium seating, that their presence here must involve some kind of deception or criminality because the alternative, that they'd earned this through achievement and been honored by adults who valued them, apparently didn't compute in Derek's worldview. Our school bought them for us, Joshua explained, trying to keep his voice respectful even as indignation rose in his chest. We won the state debate championship and we're traveling to nationals in D.C. today. Our principal wanted to honor us by letting us fly first class. He said it with pride because it was something to be proud of, because he and Elias had worked incredibly hard for this recognition, but Derek's expression didn't soften with understanding or congratulations. If anything, it hardened with what looked like resentment, like the idea of black excellence being rewarded offended him personally. Your school, Derek repeated slowly, dragging the words out like he was tasting them for lies. Your public school in Baltimore bought 2 first-class tickets for middle school students. That seems unusual. That seems like the kind of story someone would make up to explain tickets they obtained through less legitimate means. Elias started crying quietly, tears rolling down his cheeks as he registered the accusation being leveled at them, the suggestion that they were thieves or liars or somehow undeserving of the seats they occupied, and Joshua felt rage mixing with his fear because his little brother didn't deserve this, didn't deserve to have his achievement turned into something criminal, didn't deserve to learn at 11 years old that being excellent while black wasn't protection against racism but sometimes seemed to invite it. It's true, Joshua said with more force now, his debate training kicking in even as his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. You can call our principal Robert Chen at Frederick Douglass Academy. You can verify everything we're saying. We have nothing to hide because we didn't do anything wrong. Derek handed the phone back with a dismissive gesture, his face arranged in an expression of professional skepticism that barely masked contempt, and he said, I'm going to need to verify this through proper channels. You boys just sit tight while I check some things. But something about the way he said it made Joshua's stomach drop because it didn't sound like verification, it sounded like a threat. Like Derek had already decided they were guilty and was just going through the motions of building a case to justify whatever he planned to do to them. Other passengers in first class were watching now, the earlier warmth and encouragement replaced by suspicious glances and careful distance, the businessman who'd asked about their debate topic now studiously ignoring them, the elderly woman who'd complimented their ties suddenly very interested in the safety card, and Joshua felt the shift in energy, felt how quickly black children could go from celebrated to suspected based on nothing except one white man's hostility. Derek walked toward the front galley, his radio crackling as he spoke to someone in low tones Joshua couldn't make out, and Elias whispered to his brother, what's happening? Why is he being mean to us? We showed him our tickets. And Joshua had no good answer except to squeeze his little brother's hand and say, I don't know, but it's going to be okay. We didn't do anything wrong, so nothing bad can happen. Lies that came from a place of wanting to protect Elias from understanding how little doing nothing wrong mattered when someone with authority decided you were a problem. The minutes stretched out agonizingly, other passengers boarding and finding their seats while Joshua and Elias sat in a bubble of anxiety wondering what Derek was verifying, what proper channels he was consulting, whether this would somehow derail their entire trip and make them miss the debate they'd worked so hard to reach. The plane filled up, overhead bins slamming shut, flight attendants doing safety checks, the normal pre-departure routine happening around them while they existed in suspended terror. And then Derek reappeared carrying what looked like a handheld electronic device, black and official-looking with buttons and a small screen, and he approached row 3 with an expression of grim satisfaction that made Joshua's heart sink because whatever was about to happen, Derek looked pleased about it, looked like someone who'd found the justification they were seeking. I'm going to need to scan your boarding passes with this verification device, Derek announced loudly enough that surrounding passengers turned to watch. We've had issues with fraudulent tickets lately and your story raised some red flags that require additional screening. This is standard security protocol, so please cooperate fully. And he held up the device like it was official airline equipment even though something about it looked wrong to Joshua, looked too generic, too much like something purchased at an electronics store rather than issued by Delta Airlines. Joshua held up his phone again, his hands shaking now with the adrenaline of knowing something very bad was unfolding, and Derek waved the device over the screen while watching its display with theatrical concentration, and after a moment that felt eternal the device made a beeping sound, harsh and negative. Derek Morrison pulled the scanner away from Joshua's phone with exaggerated slowness, his face arranged into an expression of vindicated suspicion as the device's negative beep echoed through the first-class cabin loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, and he shook his head with manufactured disappointment like he'd discovered exactly what he expected to find. Like Joshua and Elias had confirmed his worst assumptions simply by existing in seats he'd predetermined they didn't belong in. "These tickets are fake," Derek announced in a voice pitched to carry throughout the cabin, designed to humiliate as publicly as possible. "This scanner confirms what I suspected from the beginning. You boys are traveling on fraudulent boarding passes, and that's a federal offense. Now I need you to explain to me very carefully where you actually obtained these tickets and who helped you commit this fraud." The words landed like explosions in Joshua's chest, each syllable detonating his sense of safety and replacing it with pure panic because this couldn't be happening. Their tickets weren't fake. Principal Chen had purchased them directly from Delta's website using the school's credit card. Everything was legitimate and documented and real. But Derek was standing there with his official-looking scanner and his flight attendant uniform and his white man's authority telling them that reality didn't matter, that documentation didn't matter, that the truth was whatever he decided it was regardless of evidence. "That's not true," Joshua said, his voice rising with desperation he couldn't control anymore. "Our tickets are real, our principal bought them, the gate agent scanned them and let us through, they confirmed everything was valid, you can check with them, you can call the gate right now and verify." But Derek waved away his words like they were smoke, irrelevant and easily dispersed. "I don't need to check anything," Derek said with cold finality. "My scanner just confirmed these are counterfeit tickets, and you boys need to start being honest with me about how you got them because lying to a flight crew member is a crime. Now where did you really get these boarding passes? Did someone sell them to you? Did you find them somewhere? Did an adult give them to you and tell you to pretend they were yours?" Each question was designed to strip away another layer of dignity, to transform achievement into criminality, to make Joshua and Elias complicit in their own victimization by forcing them to defend themselves against accusations that had no basis in reality but carried the weight of authority behind them. And Elias was crying openly now, his small body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken, from the place where children store their faith that adults will protect them and the world will be fair if they just follow the rules. "Our school gave them to us," Elias managed to choke out between sobs, his voice so thick with tears it was barely intelligible. "We won the debate championship and Principal Chen bought them to honor us. We're not lying, we're not criminals. Please just call our school and ask them, please." And the begging in his voice, the raw pleading of an 11-year-old child desperate to be believed, should have moved any human being with a functioning conscience, but Derek's face remained impassive, unmoved by suffering he'd deliberately created. Other passengers throughout first class were watching with varied expressions, phones out recording this confrontation from multiple angles, capturing evidence that would later go viral but doing nothing in the moment to intervene, to say this is wrong, to use their adult voices or their witness privilege to shield two children from an attack they should never have had to endure alone. The businessman who'd earlier engaged them in conversation about constitutional law now sat with his laptop open pretending not to see what was happening 3 feet away. The elderly woman who'd complimented their ties studied her magazine with sudden intense focus, and the young black mother with the baby who'd given Joshua that proud nod earlier looked like she wanted to speak but fear kept her frozen. The same calculation that keeps so many people silent when intervention might cost them something, might mark them as difficult, might draw the attention of authority onto themselves. Joshua felt their silence like additional wounds, like each person who chose not to speak was inflicting their own small violence by permission, teaching him and Elias that even when discrimination happens in plain sight with witnesses everywhere, most people will protect their own comfort over someone else's humanity. "I've been very patient with you boys," Derek said, his voice taking on a tone of false magnanimity that made Joshua want to scream. "But my patience has limits and we have a flight to operate. Now I'm going to give you 2 options and I suggest you choose wisely. Option 1 is I call airport police and have you removed from this aircraft and charged with attempting to board with fraudulent documents, which would mean missing your supposed debate and possibly facing criminal charges. Or option 2 is you admit these tickets aren't really yours, you move to available seats in the back of the plane where you actually belong, and we forget this whole unfortunate misunderstanding ever happened. I'm offering you mercy here, so I suggest you take it." The cruelty of framing forced relocation to the back of the plane as mercy, As a favor Derek was doing them rather than another act of discrimination, made Joshua feel sick to his stomach because this was the choice. This was always the choice for black people in America. Accept humiliation and survive or demand dignity and face destruction. And he was 13 years old and his little brother was 11 and they had a debate competition in 4 hours that they'd worked a year to reach and Derek held all the power and all the authority and Joshua had no idea what to do except try to save what he could from this disaster. If you're watching this thinking someone should have helped those boys, someone should have spoken up, then subscribe to this channel right now and promise yourself you'll be that someone next time you see injustice happening in front of you, because your silence allows this to continue. Your comfort isn't worth more than children's dignity. And if you can't hit that subscribe button after watching kids be terrorized, then you're part of the problem that keeps racism alive in 2025. Please, Joshua said one more time, his voice breaking completely now, just call our principal, his number is on our school website, he'll confirm everything, but Derek was already shaking his head, already reaching for his radio. Derek's hand moved to his radio with deliberate slowness, his fingers wrapping around the device in a gesture clearly designed to intimidate rather than communicate, and he said with manufactured concern that felt more like a threat, I'm going to have to contact airport security if you boys continue to be uncooperative. Continuing to claim fraudulent tickets are legitimate is only making this worse for yourselves. Now I've offered you a reasonable solution and I suggest you take it before this situation escalates beyond my ability to help you. The framing was masterful in its cruelty, positioning himself as their potential savior rather than their tormentor, suggesting that the violence being done to them was somehow their fault for not accepting humiliation gracefully, for not being grateful that a racist flight attendant was offering them the privilege of sitting in the back of the plane instead of being arrested. Joshua's mind raced through options that all led to disaster. If they refused Derek's demand, they'd be removed from the flight entirely and miss the national debate championship that represented a year of work and their school's first ever appearance at nationals. If they accepted his demand, they'd spend the flight in the back being treated like criminals while their first-class seats sat empty as monuments to their humiliation. And either way, Derek won. Either way, racism got to reshape reality and destroy black excellence while witnesses did nothing except record content for social media. Where did you really get these tickets? Derek demanded again, his voice harder now, dropping the pretense of patience. I want the truth. Did you steal someone's credit card information? Did you hack into the airline system? Did an adult give you stolen tickets? Because there's no way your story about a school honoring you makes any sense. Public schools don't have that kind of money, and even if they did, they wouldn't waste it on middle school kids flying first class. The accusations escalated with each question, moving from fraud to theft to hacking, painting Joshua and Elias as increasingly sophisticated criminals despite them being children who'd done nothing except work hard and achieve something remarkable, and Elias's crying intensified to the point where he was gasping for air between sobs, his face buried in his hands as he tried to make himself as small as possible, tried to disappear from this nightmare through sheer force of will. We didn't steal anything, Joshua said through tears he could no longer hold back, his voice raw with desperation and grief. We're telling you the truth. Our principal Robert Chen bought these tickets with school funds to honor us for winning the state championship. The gate agents at check-in scanned our tickets and verified them. They smiled at us and congratulated us and said we were all set. How could they do that if our tickets were fake? Your own airline employees confirmed we belonged to. Derek's face twisted with something that looked like rage at being contradicted, at having his narrative challenged by children who should have accepted their subordinate position without resistance, and he leaned closer to Joshua in a way that felt physically threatening despite not actually touching him, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Are you calling me a liar, boy? Are you suggesting that I don't know how to do my job, that my scanner is wrong, that my professional judgment is incorrect? Because that kind of disrespect toward a crew member is grounds for removal all by itself. And he straightened up and addressed the surrounding passengers in a louder voice. I apologize to all of you for this disruption. We're dealing with a ticketing situation that should have been caught at the gate. I'm working to resolve it as quickly as possible so we can depart on time. The performance was designed to turn other passengers against Joshua and Elias, to make them the villains causing delays rather than the victims of discrimination, and Joshua saw it working in the subtle shifts of body language around them, The way people who'd been watching with uncertainty now looked annoyed, frustrated that their travel was being interrupted by these problematic children, and the isolation felt complete. Felt like drowning in a room full of people who could save you but were choosing to watch instead. Joshua pulled out his phone with shaking hands and tried calling his mother, pressed her contact and held the device to his ear, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times before a recorded message informed him that the number he was trying to reach was not available. Please try again later, and the automated voice felt like another door slamming shut, another avenue of help closing off. He tried his teacher next, his fingers fumbling over the screen as tears made everything blurry, and got the same result, the same soul-crushing message that he couldn't reach anyone who might have power to help them, and Derek watched these failed attempts with visible satisfaction, with the expression of someone who knew they had their victims completely trapped. Having trouble reaching your people, Derek asked with false sympathy that was really mockery. That's unfortunate, but we can't wait around all day while you try to get your story straight. I need a decision right now. Either you accept my generous offer to relocate you to the back of this aircraft, or I'm calling security to have you removed entirely. You have 60 seconds to choose. Elias grabbed Joshua's arm with both hands, his small fingers digging in with desperate strength, and he whispered through hiccuping sobs, "Please, Joshua, I don't want to miss the debate. Please just do what he says. We can still compete if we stay on the plane." And Joshua felt his heart breaking because his little brother was right. They'd worked too hard and come too far to let Derek's racism steal this opportunity completely, but accepting this humiliation felt like betraying everything there. Parents and teachers had taught them about standing up for themselves, about not letting anyone treat them as less than human. The gate agents verified our tickets, Joshua said one more time, putting every ounce of conviction he had into the words. They scanned them and confirmed they were authentic. Doesn't that prove anything to you? Doesn't that matter at all? It doesn't matter what happened at the gate, Derek said with finality. What matters is what my scanner is telling me right now. What matters is my professional assessment of this situation, and I'm telling you these tickets are fraudulent and you need to move. Now you've got 30 seconds left to decide. Back of the plane or off the plane entirely, those are your only options. Joshua looked at his little brother's devastated face streaked with tears and saw in Elias's eyes a pleading that transcended words, a desperate hope that his older brother could somehow fix this nightmare they'd been trapped in, could find the magic combination of words or actions that would make Derek see reason and let them stay in the seats they'd earned. But Joshua knew with crushing certainty that no such magic existed, that Derek had decided their fate before ever approaching their row. And nothing they said or did would change a decision rooted not in policy or evidence but in pure racial hatred that couldn't be reasoned with or appealed to. "We'll move," Joshua said quietly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, bitter and choking, each syllable a small death of dignity that he'd carry with him forever. "But we want it on record that we were forced to do this, that our tickets are legitimate and this is discrimination." And Derek's smile at hearing Joshua's surrender was triumphant and cruel, the expression of someone who'd wielded power successfully and enjoyed watching his victims break under its weight. "Smart choice," Derek said, his voice dripping with condescension that made it clear he didn't think Joshua was smart at all, just appropriately submissive. "Now gather your things quickly and follow me. We're already behind schedule because of this situation and we need to get you relocated so we can close the doors and depart." Joshua and Elias stood on legs that felt unsteady, their hands fumbling with their carry-on bags and their debate materials, textbooks and note cards and carefully prepared arguments about constitutional rights and equal protection under the law, the irony of which wasn't lost on Joshua even through his devastation, that he was being marched to the back of a plane for being black while carrying research about the 14th Amendment and cases like Brown versus Board of Education that were supposed to have ended this kind of treatment 70 years ago. The walk down that aisle felt infinite, every step a public humiliation witnessed by 140 passengers who watched with expressions ranging from pity to indifference to what looked disturbingly like approval, and Joshua kept his eyes forward, trying not to see the faces, trying not to register the phones recording their shame, trying to protect what remained of his dignity by refusing to acknowledge the audience to his degradation. Elias stumbled once near row 15, his vision blurred by tears he couldn't stop, and Joshua caught his arm and steadied him, whispering, "It's okay, we're almost there, just keep walking." Lies meant to comfort even though nothing was okay and wouldn't be okay again. Not really, not after this. They passed through the galley separating first class from economy, through the invisible but very real boundary that divided passengers who mattered from passengers who were tolerated, and the symbolism of crossing that threshold felt heavy with historical weight, felt like being forced to the back of the bus or the colored section of the theater or any of the other spaces where America had historically decided black bodies belonged regardless of their achievements or their ticket prices or their fundamental humanity. Row after row of economy seats stretched before them, passengers already settled in scrolling phones or reading books or sleeping, most not even noticing the two crying children being marched past them toward the rear of the aircraft. And Joshua wondered how many injustices happened every day that people simply didn't see because they weren't looking, because noticing would require them to care and caring would require them to act. Derek led them all the way to row 38, the very last row before the bathroom, the worst seats on the entire plane with limited recline and constant traffic and the smell of chemicals from the lavatory, and he gestured to the two seats by the window with the air of someone bestowing a favor rather than inflicting a punishment. "Here you go," he said. "These seats will work just fine for you, much more appropriate than where you were sitting, and you should be grateful I'm not having you removed from the flight entirely given the ticketing irregularities. Now sit down and stay quiet for the rest of the flight and we won't have any more problems." The threat implicit in that last statement was clear. Any further complaint or resistance would result in worse consequences, would justify Derek calling security or the captain or whoever else he needed to complete their humiliation. Joshua and Elias slid into the cramped seats, their long legs that had fit comfortably in first class now pressed uncomfortably against the seats in front of them, their backpacks crammed at their feet because the overhead bins were already full, and they sat in numb silence as Derek walked away looking satisfied with his work, looking like a man who'd successfully defended first class from infiltration by people he deemed unworthy of it. The plane's engine started with that distinctive whine that usually signaled the beginning of adventure but now just meant being trapped at 30,000 feet with their tormentor, and the captain's voice came through the intercom welcoming everyone aboard Delta Flight 4729 with service to Washington, D.C., estimated flight time 1 hour and 15 minutes. Weather looking clear. Sit back and enjoy your flight. Elias turned to Joshua with eyes so full of pain and confusion that it felt like looking into a mirror of his own soul, and he asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Why did this happen to us, Joshua? What did we do wrong to deserve this?" And Joshua had no answer because they hadn't done anything wrong. Their only crime was existing as black children in spaces white supremacy wanted to reserve for white comfort, but he couldn't explain that to his 11-year-old brother in a way that wouldn't destroy something essential, so he just pulled Elias close and said, "I don't know, buddy. I don't know. Sometimes people are just mean for no reason." The seatbelt sign illuminated with its familiar ding. Flight attendants began their safety demonstrations that Joshua and Elias couldn't focus on through their tears, and as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Joshua felt despair settling over him like a weight he'd carry forever. The knowledge that excellence wasn't protection, that doing everything right didn't guarantee fair treatment, that the world was crueler than he'd wanted to believe. His phone sat heavy in his pocket, still showing no signal, still unable to connect him to the adults who might have helped if only they'd known what was happening to their students. The plane climbed to cruising altitude with that distinctive change in engine pitch that marked the transition from ascent to level flight. The seatbelt sign dinged off with permission for passengers to move about the cabin, and Joshua sat in row 38 staring at nothing while his mind replayed the humiliation on an endless loop, each replay finding new details to fixate on. The businessman who'd stopped mid-conversation when Derek approached, the elderly woman who'd looked away rather than witnessed their suffering, the satisfied smile on Derek's face when Joshua finally surrendered and agreed to move. Elias had cried himself into exhausted silence, his head resting against the window, his small body occasionally shuddering with leftover sobs, and Joshua felt the weight of being the older brother, the protector who'd failed to protect, the one who was supposed to know what to do but had been just as powerless as his 11-year-old sibling. 40 minutes into the flight, Joshua's phone vibrated in his pocket with unexpected force, startling him from his grief-induced stupor, and when he pulled it out the screen showed one bar of cellular service, weak and flickering but there, a connection to the outside world that hadn't existed since they'd been forced to move. His fingers trembled as he navigated to his contacts, scrolling past his mother whose shift at Johns Hopkins meant she couldn't answer even if the call went through, past his debate coach who wouldn't have the power to help from Baltimore, landing on Principal Robert Chen whose name sat there like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning, and Joshua pressed the call button before the single bar of service could disappear, before this fragile connection to help could evaporate like everything else that had gone wrong today. The phone rang twice, 3 times, and Joshua's heart hammered against his ribs with desperate hope that felt dangerous because hope had betrayed him so many times already today. But then Principal Chen's voice came through the speaker, warm and concerned, asking Joshua, "Is everything okay? You should be landing soon. Are you boys excited for the competition?" The kindness in that greeting, the assumption that everything was fine and they were having the adventure they deserved, broke something in Joshua's chest and he started crying again, tears he thought he'd exhausted finding new reserves as he tried to explain through sobs that caught in his throat and made words difficult. "Principal Chen, we need help," Joshua managed to choke out, his voice raw and desperate. "Something terrible happened on the plane. A flight attendant said our tickets were fake and he moved us to the back and called us animals and nobody helped us, and we tried to tell him you bought the tickets and the gate agents confirmed them, but he wouldn't listen, and now we're sitting in the worst seats and everyone thinks we're criminals and I don't know what to do." The words tumbled out in a rush, disconnected and jumbled. But Principal Chen must have understood enough because his tone shifted immediately from casual warmth to focused intensity, the voice of an educator who'd spent decades advocating for students who needed someone to fight for them. "Joshua, slow down and tell me exactly what happened from the beginning," Principal Chen said, his calm cutting through Joshua's panic like an anchor in a storm. "What flight attendant? What did he say to you? I need all the details right now." So Joshua told him everything, Elias sitting up now and leaning close so he could hear their principal's voice, and Joshua recounted Derek Morrison's initial suspicious questions, the fake scanner he'd produced, the declaration that their tickets were fraudulent, the accusations of theft and hacking, the forced relocation while other passengers watched and filmed but didn't intervene. And with each detail, Principal Chen's breathing got harder, audible even through the phone connection. Sound of rage building in someone who loved these boys and was hearing about their mistreatment in real time. "That racist son of a," Principal Chen started, then caught himself and said, "Joshua, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What that flight attendant did to you is illegal. It's discrimination, it's a civil rights violation, and it's about to have consequences that will end his career. Now I need the flight number and the attendant's name if you have it." Joshua rattled off Flight 4729 and described Derek Morrison in enough detail that he could be identified, and Principal Chen said with cold fury, "Okay, here's what you need to know, and this is going to sound unbelievable, but I promise you it's true. My brother, my actual blood brother, is David Chen. He's the CEO of Delta Airlines. We grew up together in San Francisco, and he's one of the most powerful people in the aviation industry, and he's about to find out that one of his employees just committed a federal crime against 2 children I care about deeply." The revelation hit Joshua like electricity, like suddenly understanding that the powerlessness he'd been drowning in wasn't permanent, that there was someone with authority who would believe them and act, and he felt something shift in his chest from despair to the first flickering of hope that maybe justice was actually possible. "I'm calling David right now," Principal Chen continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm going to tell him everything you just told me. And Joshua, I want you to understand something. That flight attendant made the worst mistake of his career when he decided to target my students, when he decided that black excellence was threatening enough to require elimination, because my brother doesn't tolerate racism in his company and he has the power to make sure there are real consequences. Now, you and Elias stay exactly where you are and watch what happens when racism meets accountability." Joshua heard Principal Chen's fingers already dialing another number, heard him say, "Hold on Joshua, I'm adding David to this call," and then a new voice came through, distinguished and authoritative, asking Robert, "What's wrong? You never call me during work hours unless it's serious." "It's serious," Principal Chen said, his words clipped and furious. "Right now at this very moment 2 of my students, 13 and 11-year-old black boys who won the state debate championship, are sitting in the back of your Flight 4729 after being called animals and forcibly removed from the first-class seats I purchased for them by a racist flight attendant who declared their legitimate tickets fraudulent, who used a fake scanner to justify his discrimination, who humiliated them in front of 140 passengers. And David, I swear to God, if you don't handle this immediately, I'm calling every news outlet I know. The silence on the CEO's end lasted only seconds but felt eternal, and when David Chen spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone whose entire company's reputation had just been threatened. Give me the flight number, the attendant's name, every detail you have, because whoever did this is fired as of right now. Principal Robert Chen provided the information with precise efficiency, his voice steady despite the fury underneath. Flight 4729 from Baltimore to D.C. departed approximately 50 minutes ago, so they should be somewhere over Maryland or Northern Virginia right now. The attendant's name is Derek Morrison, white male, probably in his 40s. And Robert, the scanner he used to declare their tickets fake wasn't even real Delta equipment. He brought out some generic handheld device to manufacture. Justification for removing them: this was premeditated discrimination against children. David Chen's keyboard could be heard clicking rapidly in the background as he pulled up flight manifests and crew rosters, his breathing audible and sharp as he processed what his brother was telling him. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the cold precision of someone used to making decisions that affected thousands of lives and didn't hesitate when those decisions involved protecting his company's integrity. Derek Morrison, David repeated, pulling up personnel files that clearly told a story he didn't like. I'm looking at his employment record right now, and this is exactly the kind of pattern we've been trying to root out. He's had 3 informal complaints about discriminatory behavior in the past 18 months. All of them dismissed or downgraded because he paused and his voice took on a tone of disgust. Because his uncle is Gerald Morrison, who's a deputy director at Baltimore, Washington International Airport. Derek's been protected by nepotism and family connections that let him think he's untouchable, that he can abuse passengers without consequences as long as he has the right last name and targets people who don't have the resources to fight back. The revelation explains so much about Derek's confidence. His certainty that he could humiliate Joshua and Elias without facing repercussions, his performance of authority backed by the knowledge that complaints against him historically disappeared into bureaucratic channels controlled by family allies. Well, his protection just ran out, David Chen said with finality. I'm conferencing in my chief of operations right now, and we're calling that cockpit immediately. Derek Morrison's career ends today, and I don't care whose nephew he is. Discrimination against minors is a federal violation, and I will not have my airline associated with racism, period. Another line clicked on, a woman's voice identifying herself as Sarah Martinez, Chief Operating Officer, and David briefed her in under 60 seconds, his words economical but devastating, describing the incident and Derek's history and the immediate action required. And Sarah's response was swift and unequivocal: we need witness statements from other crew members, passenger testimony if available, and a direct confrontation with Morrison to hear his version before we terminate. But if the facts are as described, he's done. We fire him upon landing and ban him from ever working in aviation again. I want more than that, David Chen said, his voice taking on an edge that suggested he wasn't just angry about this specific incident but about what it represented. I want a full investigation into every complaint that was dismissed because of his family connections. I want to know how many other passengers he's harassed who didn't have the resources or connections to get justice. And I want new training protocols implemented immediately for all flight crew on recognizing and refusing unlawful orders from colleagues, because that attendant Rosa who helped these boys board did nothing when Derek removed them, and that failure to intervene is almost as bad as the discrimination itself. Joshua listened to his future being discussed by people with real power, felt the surreal experience of hearing adults take his trauma seriously and transform it into actionable consequences, and Elias grabbed his hand, squeezing tight as they both processed that maybe justice was actually going to happen. I'm calling the captain right now, Sarah Martinez said, her voice moving with the efficiency of someone executing a plan that had been waiting for the right trigger, and Joshua heard the sound of another line being dialed, heard it ring twice before a voice answered, identifying himself as Captain Williams. And Sarah said without preamble, Captain, this is Sarah Martinez from corporate headquarters. I'm calling with CEO David Chen on the line regarding a critical incident involving racial discrimination by one of your flight attendants against minor passengers. We need immediate access to Derek Morrison, and we need witness statements from your other crew members. This is being treated as a priority 1 situation with potential federal violations. The captain's confusion was audible, his voice uncertain as he said, "I'm not aware of any incident. What are you referring to?" And David Chen cut in with barely controlled anger. "Your flight attendant Derek Morrison used a fake scanner to declare legitimate tickets fraudulent, called 2 black children animals, and forcibly relocated them from their assigned first-class seats to the back of the aircraft while passengers filmed but didn't intervene. And Captain Williams, you're telling me you weren't informed of any of this, that your crew removed passengers based on fake evidence and you had no idea it was happening?" The captain's silence was damning, revealing a failure of communication or oversight that had allowed Derek to operate with impunity, and when he finally responded, his voice carried the tension of someone realizing their own career might be at stake. "I was not informed of any passenger relocation. I'll speak with my cabin crew immediately and get to the bottom of this." "Get Derek Morrison on the line right now," David Chen ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who owned the metaphorical ground everyone else stood on. "I want to hear his explanation directly. I want to know what possible justification he thinks he has for what he did to those children." There was rustling and muffled conversation in the background, the sound of the captain leaving the cockpit and moving through the aircraft, and then a new voice came on the line, defensive and uncertain. "This is Derek Morrison. Who am I speaking with?" "This is David Chen, CEO of Delta Airlines, and you're about to explain to me why you removed 2 minor passengers from their assigned seats using equipment that doesn't exist in our inventory and language that violates every policy we have." Derek's voice changed immediately, taking on a tone of false professionalism that couldn't quite hide the panic underneath. "Mr. Chen, I was following standard security protocols. Those passengers had questionable documentation and I made a judgment call in the interest of flight safety and passenger comfort. I stand by my decision." David Chen's voice came through the phone connection cold enough to freeze water, his words measured and deliberate in the way that meant he was exercising tremendous control over anger that wanted to explode. "Mr. Morrison, you just lied to me in your first sentence, and we're going to go through exactly why that lie destroys any credibility you might have had. First, you claim you followed standard security protocols, but Delta Airlines has no protocol that involves using personal handheld devices. To verify tickets, our verification happens at gates and through official airline scanners. So explain to me where you obtained the device you used and what training you received on its operation." The silence from Derek's end stretched long enough that Joshua could hear him breathing, could almost feel the panic radiating through the phone as Derek realized his story was falling apart under the weight of someone who actually knew airline policies and procedures. "I used a standard verification scanner," Derek said, his voice less confident now, faltering under scrutiny. "It's part of our security equipment and I was trained on how to use it when situations arise that require additional screening." "That's your second lie," David Chen said flatly. "I'm looking at Flight 4729's equipment manifest right now and there is no handheld verification scanner assigned to that aircraft. Furthermore, our training records show you've never completed any certification for security screening equipment because flight attendants don't use that equipment, gate agents do. So you either brought a device from home or borrowed something that isn't airline issued and you used it to manufacture false evidence against 2 children. Is that accurate, or would you like to tell me a third lie?" Derek's breathing got heavier, audible through the speaker, and when he spoke again his voice carried defensive aggression, the tone of someone cornered who decided attack was better than admission. "I've been flying for Delta for 12 years. I know suspicious behavior when I see it. Those kids didn't belong in first class and their story about a school buying them tickets didn't make sense. I was protecting the integrity of premium seating and ensuring passenger comfort for those who actually paid for the service." "There it is," Principal Robert Chen said, his voice cutting in sharp and furious. "There's the racism laid bare, protecting the integrity of premium seating from black children, ensuring comfort for passengers who you decided actually belong there based purely on skin color. You just confessed to racial profiling while trying to defend yourself." Sarah Martinez joined back in, her voice carrying the weight of HR authority. "Mr. Morrison, I've just reviewed testimony from flight attendant Rosa Hernandez who states that she personally helped these passengers board, verified their tickets at their seats, and found no issues with their documentation. She also states that you approached her after they were seated and made comments about them not looking like they belonged in first class, that you expressed doubt about their tickets before you ever examined them, before you had any evidence at all to question their legitimacy, which establishes that your decision to remove them was based on prejudice, not on any actual security concern. The walls were closing in on Derek from every direction, each piece of evidence contradicting his narrative, each witness statement revealing his discrimination, and Joshua felt a grim satisfaction mixing with his lingering trauma because finally someone was holding Derek accountable instead of protecting him. "I want to speak with my union representative," Derek said, his voice now openly panicked. "I'm being unfairly targeted here and I have rights as an employee." "You do have rights," David Chen said, his tone making it clear those rights wouldn't save Derek from consequences. "You have the right to union representation during termination proceedings. You have the right to appeal through proper channels. But what you don't have is the right to discriminate against passengers, to use fake equipment to justify removal of children from seats they legitimately purchased, or to call human beings animals because you don't like their skin color, and multiple. Passengers recorded your behavior, so we have video evidence that will be part of the federal investigation I'm launching the moment we hang up this call." "Federal investigation?" Derek repeated, his voice cracking, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "You can't do that. I have family connections, my uncle is." "Your uncle is Gerald Morrison at BWI Airport," David Chen interrupted, "and I'm very much looking forward to having conversations with him about how many discrimination complaints he's buried to protect you, about whether airport authority has been misused to shield an employee from consequences for civil rights violations, and whether there's a pattern of corruption that needs DOT oversight, so please, tell me more about your family connections because they're about to become liabilities instead of protections." The silence from Derek was complete. The sound of someone realizing that the safety net he'd relied on his entire career had just been pulled away, that the power structure that protected him was being dismantled by someone with more power who didn't care about airport politics or family names. Sarah Martinez took over, her voice crisp and procedural. "Derek Morrison, as of this moment you are suspended from duty pending investigation. Effective immediately upon landing you will surrender your employee credentials and be escorted from the aircraft by security. You are not to have any contact with passengers including the minors you removed. You are not to discuss this incident with other crew members. And you will receive formal notification of termination proceedings within 48 hours. Do you understand these instructions?" Derek's response was barely audible, a whispered yes that carried the weight of career death, of consequences he'd never believed would actually reach him despite years of complaints and warnings. And Joshua felt something complicated in his chest, not quite satisfaction because Derek's downfall didn't erase their trauma, didn't give back the innocence and sense of safety that had been stripped away, but at least acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong, that someone with power saw their humanity and valued it enough to act. "Captain Williams, the first need you to personally escort those two boys back to their original first-class seats," David Chen said, his voice gentler now when talking about Joshua and Elias. "I need you to apologize to them on behalf of Delta Airlines, and I need you to ensure they receive every courtesy and comfort for the remainder of this flight. They've been traumatized enough and we owe them dignity at minimum even though dignity can't undo what they experienced." Captain Williams appeared in row 38 15 minutes later, his face arranged in an expression of professional concern mixed with what looked like genuine shame, and he crouched in the aisle so he was eye level with Joshua and Elias who'd spent those 15 minutes listening to Derek Morrison being suspended and terminated in real time, hearing justice being served through a phone speaker in a way that felt surreal and insufficient all at once. "Boys, I owe you an apology," Captain Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood his oversight had allowed children to be traumatized. "What happened to you on my aircraft should never have happened. It was discrimination, it was cruel, and it violated every policy Delta Airlines has about treating passengers with dignity and respect. I'm deeply sorry that my crew member abused his authority and that I didn't know about it until corporate headquarters informed me, and I want to personally escort you back to your original seats and ensure the rest of your flight is everything it should have been from the beginning." Joshua looked at the captain's apologetic face and felt exhausted rather than vindicated, felt the bone-deep weariness that comes from fighting battles you shouldn't have had to fight, from defending your humanity to people who should have recognized it automatically, and he said in a voice hollow with trauma, "Thank you, but we can't get back what was taken from us. We can't unfeel what we felt or unknow what we learned about how people see us. Moving us back to first class doesn't erase that. Derek Morrison called us animals or that everyone watched and did nothing." The captain's face registered the impact of those words, The understanding that apologies and seat changes were inadequate responses to the harm that had been done, but he nodded and said, "You're absolutely right. Nothing I do now can undo what happened, but I can make sure the rest of your journey is better, and I can promise you that Derek Morrison will never work in aviation again. That his behavior is being investigated at the federal level, and that Delta is implementing new policies to prevent this from happening to anyone else." Joshua and Elias gathered their belongings for the second time that flight, their textbooks and debate notes and the emotional baggage that would take years to unpack, and they walked back up the aisle toward first class with Captain Williams leading the way. And this time the other passengers watched with different expressions, some guilty, some sympathetic, some still uncomfortable, but a few actually started clapping as the boys passed. Scattered applause that grew as more people joined in, until the cabin rang with the sound of witnesses finally acknowledging what they should have prevented. The applause felt hollow to Joshua, felt like absolution these passengers were granting themselves rather than genuine support for him and Elias. Because where were these clapping hands when Derek was calling them animals? Where were these voices when they needed someone to say, "This is wrong, stop this now"? They reached row 3, their original seats that felt different now, tainted by what had happened, and Joshua and Elias slid into 3A and 3B while Rosa, the flight attendant who'd been kind during boarding, appeared with tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I should have refused Derek's order. I should have stood between him and you. I should have called the captain myself. I failed you and I'll have to live with that cowardice forever. I'm being suspended. Pending investigation and I deserve it." Joshua looked at her genuine remorse and felt some of his anger softening because at least she owned her failure. At least she wasn't making excuses or claiming she'd had no choice. And he said quietly, "You could have helped us, but you didn't. That hurt almost as much as what Derek did. But thank you for telling the truth when it mattered. Thank you for giving witness statements that helped get justice." The plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., the city appearing below them through windows that framed monuments to freedom and equality that Joshua now understood were aspirational rather than descriptive, symbols of what America claimed to be rather than what it actually was for black children trying to navigate spaces that saw them as threats. Principal Chen was still on the phone, his voice warm with relief as he said, "I'm so proud of you boys, proud that you survived this, proud that you stood up for yourselves, proud that you're still going to compete in that debate championship even after everything you've been through. You're going to walk into that competition and show everyone what Frederick Douglass Academy students are made of, what black excellence looks like even after it's been attacked." If this story broke your heart, if it made you angry at the passengers who filmed instead of helping, if you recognized yourself in those silent witnesses and felt the shame of past inaction, then subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being different. Commit to using your voice when you see discrimination instead of your camera, because children like Joshua and Elias are facing racism every single day while people around them choose comfort over courage, and your intervention could be the difference between trauma and protection. So hit that subscribe button if you believe we can do better. Derek Morrison was fired upon landing, escorted from the aircraft by security while passengers watched his perp walk. His career and reputation destroyed by consequences that came too late to prevent harm but at least proved that black children with the right connections could access justice that remained elusive for so many others. Joshua and Elias made it to the National Youth Debate Championship, competed with distinction despite their exhaustion and trauma, and finished in second place nationally, an achievement their school celebrated but that felt bittersweet to the brothers who'd learned that excellence wasn't protection, that doing everything right couldn't shield them from hatred. Delta Airlines implemented mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, created new policies requiring dual crew member verification before any passenger removal, and established an independent review board for discrimination complaints that couldn't be influenced by family connections or airport politics, changes that came from Joshua and Elias's suffering but wouldn't have existed without Principal Chen's connection to the CEO. A painful reminder that justice in America often depends on who you know rather than what's right. Derek Morrison faced federal civil rights charges. His uncle Gerald Morrison was investigated for corruption and abuse of authority, and the video of Joshua and Elias being called animals went viral with 20 million views and think pieces about airline racism and bystander complicity. But none of the consequences or policy changes or viral attention gave Joshua and Elias back their innocence. didn't erase the nightmares where they relived being called animals, didn't heal the wound of watching adults choose silence over their protection, didn't restore their faith that the world was fundamentally fair or that excellence would be enough to earn them basic dignity. And they carried those scars forward into lives shaped by trauma they never should have had to endure.